Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. I've spent a number of years teaching and writing in the field of ecopsychology and its applied arm, ecotherapy. And this is where knowledge of the psyche, of the mind, whatever you want to call it, and ecology meet for the obvious reason, as ecopsychology puts it, that the wellness of people, the psychological wellness, the physical wellness too, depends on the health of the planet. And so ecopsychology studies this. As a result, I've also participated a lot in things like environmental discussions of activism and tried to keep track of the climate science and matters ecological on a planetary scale. I'm not an expert in those, but I do try to keep informed. And one of the most consistent behavior patterns I've noticed over the years that I'd like to talk a little bit about today is this knee-jerk reaction from people on the environmental side of the house. Politically, we probably would say the left, at least in the US. This knee-jerk reaction against what are known as techno-fixes. And I've had this reaction myself, so I know how it feels. And the logic goes something like this. Technology being one of the things that got us into a state of planetary crisis to begin with is not going to get us out of it. And sometimes Einstein, who, by the way, was really into technology, he's sometimes quoted as saying that you can't solve a problem at the level that it first occurred at. So I've become convinced that there are some problems with this way of thinking, and I wanted to talk about a few of them in the hope that we can broaden the discourse a bit and make it more flexible and welcome in some much needed help in this state of environmental crisis. I don't want to be part of the circular firing squad. What Freud called the narcissism of small differences, the bickering that goes on, especially on the left. I'm more in favor of a larger approach that is open to many perspectives and hard conversations about them too. Now, one problem I see with an immediate rejection of anything technological having to do with climate crisis mitigation is we have a hard time understanding exactly what we mean by technological. So, for instance, this issue of what's been called geoengineering, we really need a different word for it because most of what we've done on the planet throughout human history is one form of geoengineering or another. So there needs to be a more precise term. But anyway, an opposition that's set up sometimes is instead of geoengineering to cool down the planet, why don't we plant more trees? So when you plant those trees, don't you use technology to do that with? Granted, it's a different technology, but isn't that a techno-fix too? And we've got a lot of science now that says that we can't plant enough trees to save ourselves that way. It's part of the solution. We should do it. It's a good thing to do. But why speak only out of our fear? So there's an interesting scenario in a novel that I like to recommend by Kim Stanley Robinson. It's called Ministry of the Future, and it takes place about maybe 30 years in advance of where we are now. So things are worse in terms of the climate and increasingly dire. And so now we've got, of course, massive heat waves. We've had those for a while. There was that massive one a few years ago that killed thousands of people in Europe, for instance. So we know from the science that those are going to get worse. And in Ministry of the Future, there's a heat wave in India that kills millions of people. At which point, the Indian government says, enough of this. And they recruit a fleet of planes and they start throwing sulfur into the air. And it works. For a few years, it cools the planet. It works. And of course, one of the fears is, well, what is this going to do to the rest of the ecosystem? And what about the monsoon and things like that? So, one of the points that comes up in the discussion in the novel is that this kind of um, climate mitigation is short term. The dust blows out of the air in a few years. So, it's to buy time. Now, I'm not going to argue for or against the effectiveness of a solution like this. What I want to highlight here is the intense opposition that doesn't even want to look at the science. And as a result of that knee jerk opposition, experiments with this are sharply limited. Interestingly, in the novel, this works well enough and raises morale enough that India becomes a clean energy superpower, a world leader in climate mitigation methods that work and that last. And not strictly technological. Reforesting is one of them, but also things like direct democracy, a revised financial system, things like that. Now, the resistance to any kind of experiment like this geoengineering experiment, is certainly understandable. There are plenty of examples throughout human history of how tech fixes broke things worse. The atomic bomb is a great example of that. Do you know that at the bomb site, the scientists were actually betting, they had a betting pool on how destructive the bomb would be when they tested it? And the range of bets went from moderately destructive to vaporize the planet. In folklore, one of the images of this kind of catastrophe is the story of the sorcerer's apprentice, the young wizard who decides to make his life easier and he automates buckets and brooms so that they do his cleaning job for him, but they start accelerating so rapidly that he can't control them. And only then does the master wizard step in and take control and say, okay, let's stop. But it is interesting that it's another wizard who solves the problem. So, speaking of problems, the initial problem here with the anti Techno-Fix attitude is that it doesn't really distinguish different kinds of technology well. And it ignores the fact that we've been using tools as long as we've been on the planet. Other species use tools as well, other primates. A second problem is the logic that because technology broke something, in this case the planet, that therefore we can't use it to fix things. Well, yeah, there's a risk that it'll make things worse. But imagine applying the same logic to other situations in your life. Let's say that your computer's on the glitch, and instead of taking it to the shop and applying more technology to fix something technologically broken, you just decide not to use computers anymore. Well, if you have the luxury and privilege of doing that, that's great. Most of us don't. You need a tech fix to correct a tech problem. In that case, we have a worldwide financial system that is creating enormous amounts of inequality, primarily because some people own, a small group of people own the resources that the rest of us need to live, which is just obscene. So imagine somebody trying to make the case that the solution to this financial technological problem is to take all the computers offline that deal with finances, which is pretty much most of them on the planet, and not use money anymore. Speaking of finance, right now there's a push, and this is something that Stan Robinson mentions in his book, to blockchain all financial accounts everywhere. It took me forever to understand what the hell a blockchain was, mainly because the explanations that I looked up on the internet were so technical and jargon laden. They're better now, but what a blockchain is simply is a kind of ledger that can't be altered, that everybody has access to. So think of it this way. You go to the store and you make a purchase, or you go to the bank, or you even do it on your computer. You make a financial transaction. it's recorded. So every single transaction financially, there's a record of. And the record is unalterable in theory. So what does this mean? No more dirty money, no more tax havens. It could be the beginning of a true people's bank. And of course, it all depends on how it's implemented. It would need to be planned much better than, say, the internet, which in many ways increases inequality. So the point in bringing this example up isn't, again, to argue for or against it, but to say that if we keep to the attitude that all techno-fixes are out, then innovative ones like that are off the table. And I don't see that that gets us anywhere. A third problem with that attitude is that it ignores successes. So, sticking again to the example of climate change, and bearing in mind too that things are getting pretty dire. We are signed up probably for at least a meter of sea rise, and that will wipe out all the beaches. That's one of many consequences. So, here are a few things that are technologically oriented that seem to be going right, at least for now. So, a report came out this week, I think just a few days ago, that declared, now we'll have to see if this actually pans out, but that the fossil age is basically running to an end. So this was based on a new analysis of how much wind and solar power was used for the world's electricity that year. So renewables are up to 12% of global electricity as of 2022. So that's up from 10% the previous year. And there was a small increase in coal burning, but this was probably temporary and may even be the peak that we're going past. So now this is, of course, being worked on by various nations. One of the ones that's starting to make a real dent is Saudi Arabia and also the Gulf nations. They've got some pretty ambitious targets for a shift to renewables. And in the United States, there are more than 10,000 projects that are waiting to be connected to the grid, tested, and be connected. So that those 10,000 something projects, that's about 2 terawatts of power. And that's as of 2023. So last year, instead of 2 terawatts, it amounted to 700 gigawatts. So much less, basically. There was a research paper that came out this week that proposed growing biomass crops in order to capture carbon from the air. And so what you do is you grow a crop, you bury the harvested vegetation, and you could use landfills to do this, and salt them so that they stay dry, and it pulls an enormous amount of carbon out of the atmosphere. In fact, Yablanovic, who's one of the people behind this project, I'll quote him. He says, "We're claiming that proper engineering can solve 100% of the climate crisis at manageable cost. If implemented on a global scale, this carbon negative sequestration method has the potential to remove current annual carbon dioxide emissions as well as prior years from the atmosphere." Now let's talk about, I could mention so many other things that are going right, agroforestry and other kinds of carbon sequestering and international agreements and on and on and on. But let's get speculative for a minute and mention some of these projects that are on the drawing board. So what do you think about bacteria that pull trace hydrogen from the air? So there's something called the Hook enzyme that comes from a bacterium called Mycobacterium smegmatis. An ugly name, but it turns what it pulls into electricity, right? Trace hydrogen into electricity, and it can be stored for long periods. It's a natural battery and it's easy to grow. What about a yeast that eats plastics? No more garbage patches in the ocean. No more plastic-filled landfills. We can use that for the project mentioned earlier. There's Paul Stamets' work, of course, micromediation. So using fungi to clean up all the toxins that we put in the soil from industry and unsustainable agriculture. The oceans have been a carbon sink for a while now, since we've been putting all the carbon into the air. What about pulling carbon out of the oceans and recharging them? That's on the drawing board too. Here's a few other ideas that are being worked on. So, solar power to pull water right out of the air. Cheap, clean desalination. That's being worked on right now. Clean water, 3D printed houses, 3D printed toilets and sewage systems. What about landscape restoration that's happening now, creating habitat corridors for animals? What about plants that are grown for bioplastics and biofuels for whatever still needs liquid fuel? There is biochar airships, possibility of a carbon tax, directing floods down into aquifers to recharge them. We just got hit with, I think the number was 17 atmospheric rivers in California, which is also a symptom of climate change, by the way. What if we could recharge the aquifers, especially in the Central Valley? How about amoeba grown in vats to make flour? What about other ones that actually draw carbon out of the atmosphere? What about using nanotech inks in our paints so that you could control the temperature in cars and buildings and keep things cool? And not use a ton of fossil fuel powered electricity to do that. All of these ideas and many others besides, all off the table if we're phobic about techno-fixes. No fusion power, no sand batteries, no thermal energy sources, no theoretically possible high-temp superconductors. Having those to convey electric energy around the world, that would make an enormous difference. All that's lost when electricity runs through power lines and dissipates, none of that would be an issue anymore. As I see it, the main danger behind the idea of the techno-fix is that it's seductive. It's got the power of enchantment behind it in the sense of any new technology that captures us to the point where we don't pay attention anymore. Think about all those people you've almost run into because they're on their cell phones. And the studies that show what nonstop gaming does to the psyche, things like that. Those are definitely dangers to avoid. But it seems to me that if we know what the dangers are and we can use technology consciously while encouraging an education in reconnection with the earth in small ways, interacting with plants and animals more, in larger ways, spending a lot more time outdoors at all different levels. It seems like that could be a truly integral form of education that prepares us for whatever awaits. Not everything we devise will work, and some of it shouldn't. But if we can remain conscious of what the dangers are, of what the enticement is, then we stand a much better chance of also not being enticed into an instant rejection of possibilities that could actually make life a lot better on this planet and help us deal with the consequences of what we've done in the past. And I like to imagine that sometime in the future, the people of that time will look back on this time and think, wow, we really screwed up. We really allowed some horrible, harmful catastrophes, some lethal catastrophes to happen, not only to us, but to other beings on this planet. Let's learn both from what happened and what we did about it so that we never, ever bring about a situation like this again. Thank you.